As crazy as this sounds, for about 6 months back in the mid-90s, I was the only, yes, the only paramedic in our Tri-County area. This area covered 2 interstates and a bunch of different highways here in western Ohio. And let me tell you, that fall and winter almost killed me. Don't ask how I ended up being the only paramedic. I think it was a mix of dumb bureaucracy and maybe having angered someone in the upper chain, who knows, but to say it was tough seems like the understatement of a century. One incident happened about 8 miles from home. 2 teenage girls lost control of their car and hit a power line, which then collapsed on them, pinning them in the car. Apparently there were serious injuries. They were conscious and coherent, but the power line was live, and for whatever reason, the power company couldn't just turn off the juice. So we first responders were forbidden from attempting to help until they could get the situation resolved. In the end, we had some local civilian farmer offer to bring his backhoe to remove the pole himself, but both girls died before we could successfully free them, more or less in front of our eyes while we tried to reassure them. Those can be the toughest kind of calls, when some nonsense gets in the way and causes deaths that just didn't have to happen. Another time I saw a driver of a truck, one that had gotten hit by a train, literally cough his lungs out of his mouth after his rib cage was almost completely crushed and shredded. I called the guy on scene. Then not even an hour later, there was a huge motorcycle accident on the interstate when a group of 4 bikers riding in loose formation had attempted to pass an 18-wheeler. I guess they didn't pass far enough away from it and the driver just didn't see them or whatever. I think one of them got drawn in towards the truck, maybe overcompensated by veering the opposite way, and crashed into one of his buddies. Then, when that guy was thrown off of his bike, he managed to get himself caught on either a foot peg or a brake lever and was, and I quote the coroner here when I say this, he was unzipped from his ankle to his armpit like a onesie. The straw that broke the camel's back and had me threatening to quit unless I got some backup was an 8-year-old boy that had drowned in his family's frog pond. I got there, pulled the kid out, then immediately started resuscitation efforts, but like so many others, I was just too late on the scene. So many lives could have been saved that winter if there had just been 1 or 2 extra bodies. I'm still mad about it, even today. My brother's a paramedic in the city, and some of the time his work requires him and his team to be accompanied by a police officer due to how violent the inner city is. In one incident, we were called out to some scene involving a dude wandering around in the middle of the freeway, completely unclothed, and he's threatening passing cars with a knife. When they arrived, a cop told them that when they got there, the guy was trying to drag 2 kids out into the middle of the freeway and was trying to throw them into the path of oncoming cars. Thankfully, the kids weren't hurt and managed to get away, but the guy stayed on scene and carried on yelling at the cars. So the cops called for more backup to confront the crazy naked guy, and my brother called the fire chief to get more bodies and to help him handle the kids, not to mention to stand by for any injuries incurred by the officers on scene. In about 10 minutes, there were 5 officers, my brother, his partner, the fire chief, and a few more paramedics, so around 10 men in total. The cops managing to coax the guy into walking near the ambulance by telling him he was going to bleed out. We didn't even know how much of the blood was his, but it was the only thing they said that seemed to make it through to him. The guy was then strapped to a litter and put in the back of my brother's ambulance, and my brother, a cop, and my bro's partner all sat in the back to check this guy out. Bearing in mind that they're all still stationary at that point, the guy's just in the back so they can examine him. But literally the moment they closed the doors behind them, I guess the guy started to feel trapped or whatever, and he starts getting super aggressive. He's not strapped down or anything, so he just rears up, punches my brother in the nose, then makes a lunge for the police officer's gun. My brother said he and his partner hit their panic buttons as soon as they heard the cop scream. He said it was nothing like he'd ever heard before. Like even in some of the worst calls he'd gotten, he'd never heard anyone so terrified as that cop when the blood-drenched psycho lunged for his pistol. Thankfully, the cop managed to fight the guy off, and he's trying to get his cuffs on the guy, but it's just not working. My brother said the cop had at least 50 pounds on the guy and was at least a few inches taller too, but the guy was either so frenzied or methed up that it was seriously touch and go for a while as to who was going to come out on top. My brother and his partner actually had to get involved, or they might have all been shot to death in the back of their own ambulance. Then suddenly, the back doors fly open, and there's all the other cops who then just pounce on the guy, and only then, with like 10 dudes on this guy, only then were they able to actually get him restrained. Somehow in all the chaos, the psycho managed to give our fire chief the old right there Fred with the handcuffs, and oh my god was that a nasty wound. Hit him right in the mouth, broke a few teeth, and split his lip almost right down to the frenum. My brother said he had a few really bad calls during his time, but only one where he thought he might actually lose his own life. My worst call had to be the time that I was talking to a patient who had been called to be taken into a 5150 hold. Think men in white coats coming for you type of stuff, for a 24-hour psych evaluation by the local police department. The guy was huge, would have made a great defensive lineman, but he was holding a small Hello Kitty flip phone, just a cheap plastic toy, and crying about his daughter. The juxtaposition is something I've never forgotten. When I got to explaining what we would be doing, which admittedly is very unpleasant and may well involve being involuntary administered medication, he started to get this look about him. I can't quite put into words how frightening it was to see a grown man put on the expression of a frightened child. It was like he really was just a little kid, trapped in the body of a heavyweight boxer. I think that's what gave everyone the impression that the guy wasn't violent. So when the guy reaches into his plaid jacket he was wearing and pulls out this little Taurus 22, I thought to myself, my God, this is it. I'm about to be murdered by an upset man-child. It sounds messed up in retrospect, but the feeling of relief I felt when he stopped, put the gun in his mouth and pulled the trigger, I just remember saying thank God out loud. It was one of the worst of all possible outcomes, but it wasn't the worst. Not for me, anyway. In which case, something tragic became something to weirdly celebrate. That feeling didn't last long, though. Not when I realized that I had gotten a mouthful of brain and skull ricocheted from the cargo container he was leaning against. That flip phone he had is just stuck in my head. How red the blood looked against it, and how many times it sang its two-tone song after the guy was dead. I also remember the smell of puke on his plaid jacket and not knowing where it came from. Weird little details, I guess. It was not as chaotic as most of my scenes. PD had 2 vehicles on scene. It was away from any busy streets, no interfering passerbys either. They were good folks, all of them, but someone dropped the ball on that one, and it almost cost me my life. I'm a cop. Saw a lot in my time on the force, some real screwed up things. But you know what? It's not really the most violent or bloody crime scenes that revisit you after you climb into bed and turn off the lights. In fact, some of the stuff that haunts you the most are the ones people wouldn't necessarily expect. For me, it comes down to what touches you personally. For example, this thing I'm about to talk about happened to a kid who was almost exactly the same age as my own son when it happened. But anyway, got a call to a wreck where a guy was doing donuts in a gravel parking lot. He was showing his son, who was about 6 or 7 at that time, all the stuff his old Jeep could do. He hit a bump and rolled the Jeep onto the roof. And guess what? Neither of them were wearing their seatbelts. Kid had to sit there with his leg pinned under the B-post next to his dad, whose head was crushed. I mean literally crushed under the dash. He was there at least 20 minutes, had to be clinically dead for at least 19 of them. I still remember that kid asking me in the back of the ambulance if his dad was okay. The guy's head had been pulverized, but with the shock of the whole thing, it just hadn't registered with the kid that his dad couldn't possibly survive something like that. I appreciate that some of you might be asking what kind of moron takes his son on a joyride like that without putting on some freaking seatbelts? I guess everyone will have their own answer for that, but as a cop, you learn not to ask questions like that after a while. You just shake your head and move on. Anything less, and you'll go crazy. Got a call to a car wreck involving some street racers. Two groups of teenagers and Mustangs both decided to basically drag race each other down the highway at like 1 in the morning. One of the cars ended up losing control as they were doing like a buck and change, smashes into the other, sending the other off into some trees. Somehow those guys just survived with cuts and bruises, but the other car, that thing went over the guardrail median and careened right into a Jeep coming the other way, and both caught fire. We got on scene and found the now extinguished burnt mess of the wreck. The passengers of the unluckier Mustang were nothing more than, I don't know how to describe it, hunks of charcoal. No bodily or facial recognition whatsoever, just like a big black ashy Cheeto, shapes that used to be people. The driver of the Jeep was severed in half, torso thrown out of the driver's side window, legs still by the pedals, and organs everywhere in the seat. Worst part about that is that it looked like they tried to crawl around for a minute, like they didn't even know that they were dead yet. He was just minding his own business too. Died because some kids decided to be idiots, then his life was over in a split second. That's probably the worst thing about the job. You just get this daily reminder of how fragile people really are. On Halloween night about 6 years ago, I was working third shift with my old partner when we got a run for an unknown medical. Usually the cops get to this sort of thing before us, plus we had no idea a dead body was involved. So when some security guard walks into the apartment and I just saw her, I got to admit, it gave me quite a scare. There she was, reclined in a lazy boy with her feet up, comfiest corpse I'd ever seen. Her eyes were rolled back and mouth agape. I mean, almost like the movies. Almost like it was fake. Over her head was a translucent plastic bag taped neatly around her neck. I don't know if this was the combination of being all comfied up in that lazy boy, a nonchalant plastic bag that was duct taped over her head, making it a possible murder, or the fact that the whole thing was going down on Halloween. But it was by far the creepiest scene I'd ever been to. I think we actually had a shooting and a stabbing on that shift as well. The point is, it was a bad one. Halloweens are always bad. But honestly, in general, the creepiest calls for me are the hangings. There's something about the way a body just hangs all listlessly in the dark, making my skin crawl just thinking about it. The last one we were dispatched to without lights and sirens, ending up at a Safeway with a bunch of cops who had no idea where the hanging was. Apparently the guy who called it in was just a customer who'd wandered into the produce section. We think it's there, so we headed into the grocery store, but then the guy mentions to us the body was at the construction site across the street. Sure enough, there it was, a well-executed hanging about 5 feet off the ground. Good rope rigged over a facade and tied to cement blocks on the other side of a chain-link fence. Seeing a dead body hanging in the dead of night is one of those things that just stays with you, you know? Like, I don't believe in ghosts or anything like that, but hauntings? Hauntings are a very real thing. They're just made of memories, not ectoplasm. I have a few other stories I wanted to share, but this turned out into a giant wall of text faster than I expected. Thanks to anyone who reads this. In some weird way, it's kind of weirdly nostalgic to think about old times and the crazier shifts. You saw some really evil stuff from time to time, but you also knew exactly how much you were helping people, which was a whole lot. EMT here, and my worst call was easily the result of an 18-wheeler going up against a sedan. The sedan had a whole family of 5 in it, mom, dad, boy, and a girl, with grandma in the back seat with the kids. When we got there and found the bodies, the mom still had the phone in her hands. Can you believe that? She caused the whole accident by texting and driving, eyes glued to her phone and not noticing the huge sweeping curve in the road. They went head on, driver to driver, and I don't think either of them had time to touch the brakes. My partner arrived about 4 or 5 minutes before me. The first thing I saw upon arrival was him, red-faced and weeping, carrying what used to be the body of a toddler-aged kid away from the car. You could barely tell what you were looking at until you saw the kid's relatively untouched leg and foot. Otherwise, I swear to you, you could have mistaken that poor kid for roadkill. I approached what remained of the vehicle's passenger side, and there was blood, hunks of flesh and brain matter just splattered all over the interior. It looked more like they'd exploded inside the car instead of being hit by something. The mom, who had been driving, was in several different pieces. Completely severed arm, the one holding the phone, still trapped between the steering wheel and the mess of twisted metal that used to be their hood and engine. Grandma was pinned behind her, broken neck, broken back, internally decapitated. This is basically when the spinal column separates entirely from the skull base, the mother of all broken necks. The lights are on, but no one's home. Only the teenage daughter in the front seat survived, which is how we know Mom was definitely texting and driving, because this occurred right as Dad was trying to take the cell phone out of her hands. I've responded to a lot of gross, gruesome things, but this was easily the most disturbing. My daughter today is about the same age as the little boy who lost his life that day, and I will never shake the image of his lifeless body, my partner crying as he carried him away. Like the others said, generally things involving kids are harder to deal with, so for God's sake, please, don't ever, ever text and drive. I've been a paramedic for almost 10 years now. There are the bad calls, then there are the worst calls, and this one is a real doozy. It's like 11:30 at night and we get a call from a pregnant lady experiencing cramps and bleeding from, well, you can guess where. We get on the scene and we find this lady standing in her driveway, shaking, pale, generally in a real bad way. I start asking her the usual questions, but then I find that not only she won't answer my questions, but there's no one else around who can. Since she was covered in the stuff, I figured she lost a lot of blood. And once we got her in the ambulance, I used a Doppler to listen for fetal heart tones, but I didn't hear a thing. I told my partner that I was going to check back inside to make sure no one else was there, so I grabbed the flashlight and walked towards the open garage. It's only then that I noticed a whole bunch of blood trails leading back inside, so I follow, turning on the house lights as I hit each room. I hit the kitchen, nothing. The TV room, nothing. Then when I finally get to the bathroom, I notice it's the only light in the house that's already turned on. I call out, saying EMTs and asking if anyone was there, but I get no answer. I then open the bathroom door and note that the blood trails are continuing right up towards a bloody toilet bowl that had the toilet seat down. I wish I would properly describe the feeling of dread I got while looking at that toilet. Like I honestly think you'd have to have been a fly on the wall to really get how horrifying it was. Plus, I think that deep down, I kind of knew what was going to be in there, and that's why I didn't want to lift the lid. I've been on the job long enough to hope for the best but expect the worst, as they say, so when I tried to imagine what the worst possible outcome could be, the reality turned out to be exactly how I imagined it. I lifted up the toilet seat, and floating among the bloody toilet paper was a miscarried fetus. If I had to guess, I'd say it was at least 28 weeks in, well into the 3rd trimester, and was honestly the single most heartbreaking and terrifying thing I'd ever seen. I'd never had a reaction like this before, but I just walked out of the bathroom, almost like I had tunnel vision. I just walked out of there and went straight back up to the ambulance, where the mom then asked me, "Can I have my baby?" And what else could I do? Tell her no? There was a canvas bag in the bathroom that had a few little makeup trays in it. I dumped them out onto the floor, got the child out of the toilet bowl, then carried it back to the mother. She didn't cry. She didn't show much emotion at all, actually. She just held that wet canvas bag in her arms as we drove her to the hospital. I've thought about that night probably way more than I should, but how I'm supposed to just get over seeing something like that, I'm honestly not sure. I'm a paramedic from the UK. I went to a call a few years ago, seemed run-of-the-mill, just a woman saying she felt unwell. I arrived to the house to be greeted by the sight of a woman who had to be 45 to 50 stone. I mean, she was absolutely ginormous, God love her. At the time, I wasn't sure if it was just lack of bathing or if there was an infection in there somewhere, but the stench coming off of her was just abominable. Because of her size, she was almost completely unable to look after herself, so there was rotten food everywhere, animal droppings all over the show, and from what her husband could make out, she hadn't been able to get off of her bed in months. This meant that she had just been defecating where she lay, and her fat had literally grown around the springs where the mattress had just rotted away, causing wounds that had no chance to heal. Essentially, her bottom was just one big bed sore, and it was fatally infected. We attempted to get her out of bed, but not without the help of fire service, who arrived with some heavy lifting equipment to get her out via some upstairs window. I'm not saying that to be mean or funny, it's just the truth. There was just no way of getting her out of there by hand. And you know what? It didn't work, or rather, the firemen weren't sure that they could get her out without her falling or the bed breaking, so, in the end, a handful of nurses had to travel out to us just to make her comfortable. Palliative care, they call it, when they basically just pump you full of drugs to make your last few hours as painless and minimally terrifying as possible. She died a few days later of a catastrophic case of septicemia. I binned my uniform after that and handed in a request for a new one. I just couldn't get the smell out of it. The wife said she couldn't smell anything, and she reckoned it was just stress or something that had me, well, hallucinating a smell. And maybe she's right. But there's no way that I was wearing that thing again. Not a chance. I'm a retired EMT. These are some of the worst calls I got in my 18 years on the job. Mother's Day of 2016. A young woman pulled out in front of a state trooper that was going 80+ miles per hour. Cleanest case of internal decapitation I'd ever seen. We cut her out, but removing the little child seat from the back was by far the worst part, knowing those little ones would never see their mom again. An hour later, we got yet another call for a traffic accident, one where a car hit a pole with a person ejected. Turned out to be another young mom. She was so messed up that I could feel organs through her chest. Called it on scene. Some days you're just not as strong as others, and the things that make you snap can sometimes be unexpected. In this case, it was the whole Mother's Day thing. That phrase just kept ringing out in my head like the bell back in high school, and made stuff much harder than it normally was. Christmas of 2008. Guy in his mid-30s with pancreatic cancer. He was at home. Nice part of town, too. His wife meets us at the door. Her husband's bed was next to the Christmas tree in a room in the back. There are tears in her eyes as she tells us that he needed to go to the hospital, how she had power of attorney papers, DNR forms, everything. Basically, he was on death's door and he needed some actual palliative care instead of just pain meds and home comforts. She left the room, and from the other room came the most gut-wrenching, heart-rending kind of half-sob, half-scream I'd ever heard. He tried his best to hang on till Christmas, and as a result, he must have been in unimaginable amount of pain. Only rarely do we let people ride in the back, but we let that lady. She held her husband's hand and told him how much she loved him, and that it was okay to let go, because she knew he was hurting and that she and the kids would be okay. He died before we got paperwork done. I know this one is probably more sad than anything else, but seeing how that guy looked in his final days, how he clung to life through sheer force of will, that one stuck with me for quite some time after. My flatmate is a paramedic. Saw this thread, so I asked her what the worst thing she's ever seen. Kinda wish I hadn't asked, to be honest, but here's what she said. She got called out to the home of a disabled couple who both used electric wheelchairs. The guy half of the couple had been a heavy drinker and heavy smoker. Bad combination at the best of times, but in this instance, he basically passed out, lit ciggy in his hand, while wearing a frigging woolly jumper of all things. By the time my mate got there, he was literally cooked. She said it smelled like pork crackling in the flat. The lady half of the couple was absolutely distraught, as you can imagine, but my mate overhears her talking to the police, telling them that she had helplessly rolled back and forth between the sink and him, getting a cup of water at a time and throwing it on him in this doomed effort to put him out. She had to watch her husband burn to death. She had to listen to him screaming. I literally can't think of anything worse than that. Like I said, I really wish I hadn't asked my flatmate about this now. I spent 3 years as a lifeguard here in Oceanside, then 1 year as an on-call EMT, and this is the call that made me quit. My unit gets called to a multi-car collision on the interstate. We arrive to a sedan that's lying on its side in the right lane and an SUV in the median over the top of the cable stop. I immediately spot 2 men and 1 woman walking around with what seem to be minor scrapes and bruises, but the woman is completely hysterical. The men are trying to calm her, but she's totally inconsolable. Fire rescue was working on the SUV, and when it rolled, it landed on the post, perfectly impaling the center car seat. The woman's 5-year-old daughter had been sitting right there in a car seat, with her 7-year-old brother next to her. The girl just got mushed, and the other kid was barely hanging in there, trapped inside the wreck. I talked to them the whole time until the firefighters got him out, but when they did, because of the tension on the cables, the kid was basically sliced in half. Didn't make it even 20 feet to the ambulance before they died in his arms. I never felt a sense of dread going to work until after that. You take certain things in stride going into that line of work, but I guess some people are just better at processing the darker stuff than I am. Because after that, I think I just psyched myself out. Then once our crew chief told me that hesitation kills, I handed in my resignation. I have no regrets, I just wish that I could have done something. So this might not be the goriest or the scariest story in this thread, and it's definitely not the goriest or scariest thing I've ever experienced, but it's definitely the most bizarre, so it's one of those incidents that sticks with me the most. This guy decided he wanted to take his own life. So he gets in his SUV, leaves one of the rear windows open, ties this huge metal cable around his neck, like the kind you use in construction, then strings it out of the open window and wraps it around a tree. Then he hits the gas. The truck lurched forward and snap. Internal decapitation. Worst I'd ever seen. Guy's head was almost 180 degrees the wrong way. And of all those sort of scenes and aftermaths I've ever saw, that was the biggest head scratcher. Shotguns are always the worst though. Some are like dismantled, scald jigsaw puzzles. You're cleaning up a scene and you see a few teeth connected to a section of jaw, maybe even an eyeball. Always a patch of skull with hair still attached. You have to just detach yourself and pretend it was never a real person, just a movie prop or something. Otherwise, it's just too sad. I was a volunteer firefighter EMT for a while when I was in college. These are the two weirdest and worst calls I got. So a guy fell off his roof and somehow landed on both feet while tensed up. Don't ask me how, I think he was drunk or something. It broke both his legs and both bones tore through the skin of his shins. I mean, it looked like he had taken a shotgun blast to each leg. It was just a mess. But maybe the most messed up part, he was home alone and his cell phone was back in the house, so he had to drag himself from where he fell about 30 feet or something, in order to lie there screaming at a neighbor's house until they came out, saw what had happened, and ran to call us. I also went to a call where a girl had a complete nervous breakdown and repeatedly bashed her head into a telephone pole. Eventually, she aimed wrong and stabbed herself in the head with a nail left over from some flyer that was there, and she was lucky not to be blinded. Also, this wasn't exactly an EMS run, as I was investigating a fire, but trust me, this one counts. I had a scene where one girl had asked her roommate to watch her dog for the weekend. The roommate got tired of the dog barking, locked him in a room with a lit Yankee candle, which the dog then proceeded to knock over. The fire department didn't take the dog's corpse away, insisting it was animal control's job. So when I got there a week later, after a week of 90 to 100-degree temperatures, the dog had basically decomposed into the floor. It was the most disgusting thing I'd ever smelled. There really is nothing else like the smell of hot death. Since the beginning of recorded history, humankind has entrusted a handful of their number with establishing and maintaining order. From the prefects and magistrates of ancient China and Greece, to the Bow Street runners of pre-Victorian England or the lawmen of the Old West, there have always been a small minority charged with the unenviable task of upholding the law. Yet at the very same instant as the concept of law enforcement was conceived, there came a question that has yet to be answered, even thousands of years later. Who watches the watchman? On Sunday, February 28, 2021, a 48-year-old British police officer telephoned a car hire company in the small coastal town of Dover. He arranged to borrow a white Vauxhall four-door sedan, due to be collected on Wednesday, March 3rd. Then, after clocking out of a 12-hour shift at the U.S. Embassy in London, he drove down to Dover to collect the car at around 7 in the morning. At the car hire's booking desk, the officer was asked to confirm the booking. The name he gave them was Wayne Couzens. Couzens had joined the Metropolitan Police just a few years earlier in September of 2018, but in February of 2020, he was assigned to the force's Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Branch, the unit responsible for protection of diplomatic premises and personnel. However, he had not undergone enhanced vetting as part of his recruitment, nor had he gone through the mandatory 2-year probation period with the Met before joining the Diplomatic Protection Branch. It's not clear whether this was because Couzens was a trusted member of the police force, or if it was sheer incompetence, but what's clear is that a person who had yet to prove themselves worthy was handed far more power than would otherwise be permitted. At the Dover car hire outlet, Couzens was handed the white Vauxhall car keys before he made the 2-hour journey back to London, where CCTV cameras captured him traveling through Earl's Court and across Battersea Bridge. Since he just worked a 12-hour night shift, there's a good chance that Couzens' disappearance for the next 8 hours or so is down to him getting some sleep somewhere, possibly in the region of Earl's Court. But the fact of the matter is that Couzens and his white Vauxhall then reappear in South London district of Clapham at around 9:20 p.m. London is one of the most heavily surveilled cities in the world, with almost 700,000 CCTV cameras perched on roadsides and street corners. That's one for every 13 people, with your average Londoner being caught on camera almost 300 times a day. Therefore, it's very possible to use the footage of these cameras to paint a picture of Couzens' movements that evening. And when we do, something chilling becomes apparent. Couzens was off duty on the evening of March 3rd, but the route of his journey around Clapham suggests that he was in some kind of patrol pattern, almost like he was looking for something, or more accurately, hunting for someone. Then, just before 9:30 p.m., Cousins parked his white Vauxhall on the pavement outside of Pointer's Court apartment complex and began to wait. Just 4 minutes later, he saw a woman, dressed in a turquoise coat and a beige woolen hat, walking towards his car. Cousins opened his driver's side door, climbed out, and confronted the woman on why she was out of doors during a strict COVID lockdown. He showed her his warrant card, explained that he was a police officer, then repeated his question. The woman had apparently been drinking wine with friends, and the officer deemed this to be a flagrant breach of quarantine guidelines and told her she was under arrest. But before Cousins put the handcuffs on her, he asked the woman her name. "Sarah Everard," she said. 33-year-old Sarah was born in the English county of Surrey in 1987, but grew up in the small Viking settlement of York in the country's northeast. She studied human geography at Durham University from 2005 to 2008, then later moved down to the Brixton Hill area of South London, where she worked as a marketing executive for a digital media agency. This is how she ended up in the path of Wayne Cousins, who placed Sarah in the back of his hired Vauxhall, then began the 90-minute drive southeast to Kent. It's more than likely, at some point, Sarah asked where she was being taken. She probably suspected she'd been taken to a police station in central London, so realizing she was being driven into the countryside would have almost certainly confused her. The exact excuse given to her by Cousins is unclear, but a safe bet would be that he told her that there were no cells free in the local area, and was therefore being taken somewhere she would be adequately detained. Given that this is both standard procedure and a believable excuse, we can understand why this might have allayed Sarah's concerns, if only for a short while. However, at some point on their journey, Cousins parked up the hired Vauxhall, took Sarah out of the back seat, then transferred her over to his personal black Seat Leon station wagon. If Sarah hadn't realized something was wrong before then, she certainly did afterward. Cousins was clearly a serving police officer. His mannerisms, lexicon, and official Met Police warrant card all attested to it. But by the time of the vehicle switchover, Sarah must have known what he was doing was wrong. Perhaps there was a shift in his demeanor, a moment where he dropped all pretense, and I dread to think of the horror Sarah felt when she realized that she was not being arrested. She was being kidnapped. Between the hours of midnight and 1 a.m., Cousins' cell phone pinged at sites at the village of Shepherdswell in eastern Kent. The full story of what he did during that time might never be told, but it's clear that he and his vehicle remained stationary in a secluded, woody area for at least an hour. And then, at exactly 2:34 a.m., Cousins can be spotted on the CCTV of a Dover petrol station, where he's thought to have purchased a number of soft drinks. The security cameras captured images of the interior of his black Seat. Sarah Everard is nowhere to be seen. Sarah had arranged a date with her boyfriend for the following afternoon. When she didn't arrive, he discovered her phone was switched off, and he immediately contacted the police. Around the same time, Wayne Cousins was returning the white Vauxhall to the car hire company in Dover. The next day, he was spotted at a hardware store near the town of Ashford, where he apparently purchased 2 large rubble sacks. Around the same time, Sarah was formally declared missing, and a number of dedicated police search teams began the delicate process of tracking her last known whereabouts. It's not clear what exactly led police to the small spot of woodland near Ashford. Perhaps it was a tip from a member of the public, or perhaps it was the very distinct smell that had been drifting through the trees during the previous day. But what's clear is that while searching a place known as Hode's Wood, police found a large refrigerator which appeared to have been set alight. It would turn out to have been used as a makeshift crematorium, as just a few yards away was a soot-stained rubble sack, one containing charred human remains. Less than 100 yards from where this rubble sack was found is a piece of privately owned land. Police sought to identify the owner of this plot, hoping they might be able to shed some light on the foul deeds committed on their doorstep, and they discovered the owner's name was none other than Wayne Cousins. By this time, Cousins' fellow police officers had noticed he was acting very, very strangely. He had been a firearms officer, what amounts to elite status in Metropolitan Police, and it was something that Cousins prided himself on. Yet he'd suddenly requested some urgent time off of work, citing stress and a desire to no longer carry a firearm. Then, when homicide detectives tried to get in touch with him regarding the grisly discovery near his Hodewood property, Cousins seemed reluctant to talk to them. This behavior would be seen as suspicious even as a civilian, but for a serving member of the Metropolitan Police to basically refuse to assist in a criminal investigation is extremely dubious. However, it wasn't until forensic investigators examined the dental records of the Hodewood cadaver that they began to piece together what had happened that night. The burned body was that of Sarah Everett, and as police began to piece together her movements from March 3rd, they made a horrifying discovery that Sarah could be placed in the company of none other than Wayne Couzens. On March 9th, 2021, Kent police arrived outside Couzens' home in the small Kentish town of Deal. Although they arrived outside at around 5:45 p.m., the officers in question didn't attempt to enter the home until around 7:50 p.m. At some point during that time, Couzens tried to erase all incriminating data from his cell phone, and although there have been accusations that Couzens was tipped off, it's more likely that he knew it was just a matter of time before he was interviewed, and that he correctly identified the car outside as belonging to homicide detectives. Yet it's also not clear why the officers on scene would take so long to make their move. It's possible that police feared the fallout of arresting a serving officer on suspicion of kidnap and murder and wanted to make sure that they were correct in their suspicions before putting him in cuffs. But regardless, Couzens was arrested that night and taken to a nearby police station to be questioned. Initially, when confronted with a photograph of Sarah, Couzens claimed not to recognize her. This was the first real sign that he'd done something unspeakable, as the officers interviewing him knew well that the pair had met. Couzens tried to make the excuse that he didn't recognize Sarah because she had been wearing a COVID mask, but it seemed highly unlikely that he'd forgotten her brightly colored coat after spending more than an hour in a car with her. When it became evident that he couldn't lie his way out of his predicament, Couzens admitted he'd taken Sarah under the pretense of an arrest. Yet he claimed his motive was purely financial, and that he hadn't actually hurt Sarah following her kidnap. He told officers he was in dire need of money after a gang of Eastern European pimps had accused him of underpaying an escort. Couzens asserted that the gang had threatened to kill his family if he didn't deliver another girl to them. Sarah had been the one unlucky enough to be chosen. Couzens claimed that after Sarah was delivered to this gang, he had no knowledge of her fate, but following the arrest and subsequent release of a presently unidentified woman, Couzens was rearrested on suspicion of murder and formally charged by the Crown Prosecution Service. The day after his arrest, while still in police custody, Couzens appears to have made a frenzied attempt at taking his own life. News broke on March 11th that Couzens had been taken to a hospital after receiving a serious head injury. Some speculated that this had been caused by an attack from another prisoner, appalled that Couzens had been accused of such a heinous murder. But it later became apparent that Couzens had sustained an injury to the top of his head while alone in a cell, leading us to believe that he'd attempted some kind of swan dive off of his cell's 2-foot-high bed. Obviously, this attempt at rendering himself unfit for trial was unsuccessful, and Couzens appeared at the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales via video link from Belmarsh Prison on March 16th. Those in attendance noted the rather painful-looking wound on Couzens' head and observed that the man himself appeared to be in very poor health. When it was confirmed that Couzens was of sound mind and fit to stand trial, he pled guilty to the kidnap, violation, and murder of Sarah Everett. Speaking outside the courtroom, the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police stated that she felt sickened, angered, and devastated by the killing. Everyone in policing feels betrayed, she added. Sarah was a fantastic, talented young woman with her whole life ahead of her, and that had been snatched away. Jim Sturman, Couzens' barrister, asked the presiding judge to consider a sentence that would allow his client parole in around 30 years. This judge then publicly stated that he had considered the request, but had still decided on what's known as a whole life tariff, a rare instance in the British legal system where a person is sent to prison without the possibility of parole. The judge added that his decision was influenced by the fact that Cousins abused his power as a police officer to detain Everett, stating that it was the vital factor which, in my view, makes the seriousness of this case exceptionally high. Never was a truer word spoken. When those we trust to protect us are the ones kidnapping, violating, and killing us, it makes a sick joke of the very concept of guardianship. As you can imagine, Sarah's murder had sparked a huge and very volatile debate on why Wayne Cousins wasn't properly vetted before being allowed into a position of power. And the flames of this outrage were only fanned when it emerged that Cousins had apparently been involved in 2 uninvestigated incidents of indecent exposure, one of which was at a branch of McDonald's in a place called Swanley. More and more information came out in the weeks that followed. One accusation was that he'd hired an escort to accompany him to a party attended by colleagues and had openly joked about the fact with close associates. 12 of his colleagues were served notices of misconduct after they gave positive character references during the aftermath of the murder, and one was suspended after he was found to have shared grossly graphic and offensive material with Cousins via social media. Such scandalous revelations rocked British society and left a spokesman for the Metropolitan Police grasping at straws in a September 30th statement which read, "If people are scared or doubt the person is a police officer, they should consider shouting out to a passerby, running into a house, knocking on a door, waving a bus down, or, if you're in the position to do so, calling 999. It was essentially an admittance that there was nothing they could do about it. A complete breakdown in trust between a citizenry and its law enforcement would mean complete anarchy. But at the same time, there's no failsafe if an officer is suddenly compelled to abuse their power, possibly even with murderous intent. What's more, the immediate response of the authorities demonstrated a shocking lack of ideas on how to keep women safer on Britain's streets. North Yorkshire Police Fire and Crime Commissioner Philip Allett faced a torrent of criticism when he suggested that people should be more streetwise, and British government's call for more police funding was shot down when it was politely pointed out to them that Cousins was a member of the police. On October 4th, the head of the Metropolitan Police announced that there'd be a full review of professional standards, telling the press, "We will look at our training, leadership, and standards of behavior and examine cases where officers have to let the public down. We'll also reevaluate our leadership on standards, corruption, misconduct, and how the Met responds when things go wrong." But talk is cheap, and in the wake of such a horrifying tragedy, the public wants action. People from a variety of backgrounds seek to become police officers, and it's a comfort to think that the majority wish to do so as a means of making the world a better place. But what's also clear is that there are those who abuse their power, either out of callousness or outright malice. And the horrifying truth is that there are some that seek to infiltrate the very same institutions designed to protect us in order to terrorize us. They are the wolves who don sheep's clothing, the monsters who wear masks of men. And as much as more should be done to ensure the power is never entrusted to them, we will never be completely, entirely safe. It's a bitter pill to swallow, but the world will always be a frightening and dangerous place, one in which we must ask ourselves, who watches the watchman? I used to be an EMT. Getting out was probably the happiest day of my life. The worst call I ever ran was a shaken baby. Mom couldn't get her 1-month-old baby to stop crying, so she shook him so hard that it caused critical damage to his brain. Baby went into what we call status epilepticus, which is a non-stop seizure. If this ever happens, call 911 immediately. Don't wait for it to be over like this mom did. It was a fatal mistake. Literally fatal. I'll never forget the filth in that trailer. The smell, human feces, old rotting pizza boxes, cat feces, overwhelming cat urine ammonia smell, dirty diapers, needles, so many cigarette butts I lost count, and it all still haunts me to this day. The little helpless infant writhing in this filth while Mom made a Pop-Tart in the midst of the suffering that she caused. That call permanently changed me. Like some of the other commenters in this thread, I'm not strictly fire department or EMT, but I do have first responder training in a forestry industry environment. So during one job I was supervising, I got a short distress call over my radio, and it had to be from one of the lumberjacks, so I headed over to the scene, arriving before anyone else. A guy is slumped over in the cab of his truck, totally unconscious, forehead resting on the steering wheel, and like all his entrails are in his arms, with some spilling onto his feet. Not able to move the guy by myself, I reclined the seat to tilt him back and tried to gauge just how bad the damage was. Thankfully, his chainsaw only cut the skin and muscle of his stomach, and no entrails were actually damaged. He just ruptured all the dermal layers, basically opening his tummy up so they could all spill out. Then, making sure to don some latex gloves, I carefully work all this guy's guts back inside of the cavity, using a water bottle to clean off all the dirt I could. Then I use clean gauze, a clear plastic grocery bag, thank God for that thing, and some duct tape to basically create a huge dressing which kept him alive until the heli evac arrived to get him out. After all was said and done, I checked the guy's GPS. He walked more than a mile with his own guts in his arms, all the way back to his truck to radio for help. I've told that story in bars all over the country, and sometimes I wonder if he knows how much of a living legend he truly is. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about all the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.